Johnny Tremaine, Chapter 11, Section 4. Getting 2,000 men, or what was left of them, for gossip was saying they had been well chewed, into boats and back to Boston would create just the confusion Dr. Warren had promised. But it would not be easy for Johnny to slip over. The soldiers were cross and frightened. He would wait a little until they were more relaxed, say about midnight. Before him, lighted from top to bottom, he saw the lights house, and he remembered Pumpkin's uniform. Dressed in that, he might slip aboard in the confusion. He went to the lights. In front of the house, he saw wagons and carts and men loading them with furniture, chests, trunk, boxes, even old portraits. The lights were moving, and by night, and in a hurry. He went to the kitchen door. Mrs. Bessie, who certainly ought to have been superintending the moving, remember because she was the chief servant, was sitting idly in the kitchen, doing nothing. Scylla sat beside her. She was doing nothing. Mrs. Bessie jerked her thumb towards the front of the house, kind of pointing. Scared, she said. They are all going to London until this insurrection, as they call it, is over. The Unicorn leaves at dawn tomorrow. Gage has given permission. Scylla, said Johnny, don't you go with them. Never. We all had a terrible fight this afternoon when word first came that us Yankees had beaten them hollow. All the other servants are Tories and are going with them. But Mrs. Bessie and I are Whigs, and we are not going with them. In the end, Mr. Light said he was glad we are Whigs, because he will leave us here to look after his property. Gage has promised nothing up here will be touched. But they don't want us around. Can't bear the sight of us, Mrs. Bessie said smugly, like she thinks she's better than them. The very sight of a good Whig makes them furious. Mr. Light did have another fit, a little medical problem, just a little one. Miss Lavinia is afraid. If she doesn't get her papa right out of town and off to London, he'll die. She always did like London better than Boston anyway. They are leaving tonight, and fast. What's Hosanna going to do? Izzy. Mrs. Bessie's lips curled. She'll go with them. She will not, said Scylla. Miss Lavinia has gone down to Hancock's Wharf to ask Ma to let her take her, but Ma couldn't give her away, just as though she was a kitten. Miss Lavinia was standing in the doorway from the dining room to the kitchen. She had on a black cloak with the hood to it over her head. She stood a moment looking about and said nothing. Johnny was on his feet. He knew he would never forget her, never. Even when he was an old man, he would remember Lavinia Light standing, framed in that doorway, saying nothing. Her eyes were angry and tired. The chisel mark, remember the wrinkle we had talked about? The chisel mark was deep between the low, sweeping black brows. He had never seen her look so worn and old, and never been more aware of her beauty. Hosanna is going with me, she said at last. Your mother, Scylla, has too many kittens. Miss Lavinia, said Scylla, you can't do that. Can't? Your mother signed the paper, and you're a wicked girl to stand in the way of your sister's good fortune. A little diffidently, a little shyly, Hosanna herself emerged from behind the lady's great dark skirts. Hosanna, said Scylla gently, you can't go off and leave me like this. It's no matter what Mother says. Look, dear, if you go to London, maybe you will never come back. Hosanna, don't go away. From me. Lavinia was smiling under her dark hood. I will leave the decision entirely to her. She shall be perfectly free to choose between us. Precious, would you rather go with me to London and be a great lady and wear silks and jewels and ride in coaches, or stay here and be just another poor working girl? And then, to make the choice doubly hard for the child, she added a little maliciously, a little evilly, which do you love most, Scylla or me? Still, Hosanna said nothing, but even in her silence, Johnny could detect something of her desire for drama. At the moment, silence was more dramatic than anything she could say. Izzy is no good, thought Johnny. She'll go. Now, to put this in perspective, Hosanna was, at the beginning of the novel, I want to say 9 years old, and it's been about 2 years, so she's only 11. She's like our little fifth graders. She is still very young to be making a decision this big. Scylla was standing quietly, well away from the child. She was too proud to make any further appeal to her. Perhaps, like Johnny, she knew what the answer would be. Well, said Lavinia, I haven't got all day. Which do you love the most? Hosanna began to cry. It was perfectly natural crying, right? We've seen Hosanna cry many times just for effect, just to heighten the drama of a situation. Not even Johnny could believe it was done for effect. "I don't know," she sobbed. "Which would you rather be? A common person like your sister or a fine lady?" "Fine lady," she sniffled and went on dreamily. "And I'll have a great pony and a pony cart. I've got the gold locket already." Her hand went to her throat. Next, she'd be saying she wanted a little sailboat. Even now, she was only reflecting old desires of Scylla's. Izana could never think up anything for herself. "Yes, dear, you will. When I am Lady Prior Morton, and you my little protege." A protege is someone that you're mentoring to become a great person, she explained to the others. "I've been betrothed or engaged to marry my lord ever since I last came back from London. Papa is a very sick man. He could never live through a civil war over here. Never. He doesn't want to leave all his property to the mob. But what does it matter? My lord is so rich. This miserable house, our shops are nothing to him. And my lord never liked it that my papa was in trade. Until now, papa would not give up his trade, nor could I bear to leave him." He turned to Scylla. "And I promise you, I will be in a position to give your sister the best care and training." "Training?" said Johnny. "What's she going to be trained for?" Now, before we move on, remember they had accused Izana of acting like a little puppy or of being a pet to Miss Light. And here they're mentioning training, which would further emphasize that she is an animal to them. "Izana shall be an actress. I would have been myself, but my station in life prevented me, her like high standing in society. And then I am too tall. And besides, I can't act. Izana shall be the toast of London. You'll be proud some day. Even over here in this dreary wilderness you shall hear her name and boast that once you knew her." Mrs. Bessie said smartly, "I'd welcome the day I was proud to know that Izzy." Scylla was not taking the parting as hard as Johnny would have expected. Now he knew that she had been through the worst of it months before, when first the two sisters had come to the lights. She had lost Izana long ago. "Now, Scylla," said Miss Lavinia, "I want you to have some time alone with Izana. You've been a good girl, Scylla, better than Izana, but happens she is what I fancy, what I like. Now go with her and help her pack her duds. Duds would be clothing." Scylla said nothing, but curtsied and went upstairs with Izana, who was once more sobbing. "You two," said Lavinia irritably to Mrs. Bessie, "you leave me, for I must talk to Johnny alone." Mrs. Bessie heaved herself up out of her comfortable chair and shut the door behind her. The young woman sat at last and murmured, more to herself than to Johnny, "I must talk to you, Jonathan Light Tremaine." Johnny raised his eyes in amazement. "I wanted to tell you before we left. First of all, Papa never meant to trick you out of your cup. He honestly thought it was an attempt at swindle, at robbery or trickery. I mean that someone here in Boston stole the cup and then found a boy to pretend to be a long-lost relative and used the cup as proof. Your mother did leave Boston with one of those cups. Papa did not mention that fact in court. There really were 5. He implied no more than 4 ever came to this country." "He didn't imply it," said Johnny. "He swore it in court." "Oh well, what of it? Let me talk. You see, he never knew that his niece, Vinnie Light, had a child. Vinnie might be a shortening of Lavinia. Vinnie Light had a child. He had it from your father's family that both she and her husband died of cholera almost as soon as they reached Marseille, which is a town in France. You see, your father was a naval surgeon, a prisoner of war while here in Boston. So given the time period when Johnny would have been born, this means that Johnny's father, especially considering they went to Marseille, which is in France, for Johnny's father to be a prisoner of war, he would have been a Frenchman fighting against the British and Americans in the French and Indian War." "Oh, nothing very much," she added scornfully. "No great fortune or title, and Vinnie Light fell in love with him. He was everywhere in society that year, although a prisoner of war, and of course the Lights wouldn't hear of a marriage. He was a Frenchman and a Catholic, and at this point in history, Catholics and Protestants, or people who were not Catholic but are Christian in other ways, would have been very divided. It wouldn't have been appropriate to marry between. And they told her if she ran off with him, she would be cut off, and she was never to return. But she did? Vinnie was so wild, she went right ahead. A ship's captain married them. Then his family, of course, would have none of her, she being a heretic, not being a Catholic. And then he died. They sent word to Papa. Your grandfather was dead, that both had died. But his family sent Vinny to a convent, hoping the sisters would convert her. A convent would be a branch of the church run by nuns. Sisters is another name for nuns. And there, 3 months after your father died, you were born. You were born in a convent in the south of France. Odd, isn't it? So let's just clarify. Then his family, of course, would have none of her, she being a heretic. So Johnny's mother, Lavinia, or Vinnie Light, was abandoned by her family for marrying this low-caliber man. And then his family didn't want them because she was not Catholic. And then Johnny's father died. And they sent word to Papa, meaning Mr. Light, that we know, because Johnny's grandfather had died. Johnny's grandfather, Vinnie Light's father, would have been Mr. Light's brother. So it's a little convoluted, but essentially it's saying that Johnny and his mother were alive in a convent in the south of France, which is near Marseille, and were alive. Why do you call my mother Vinnie? We all did. Vinnie Light, the wildest, handsomest girl in Boston. I was only a schoolgirl, but she was so beautiful and so gay, gay meaning happy in this instance. Oh, if you could but have seen her. But I did. He remembered the sweet, sad face of his sick mother. Was the wild and beautiful Vinnie Light really the same woman? His mother patiently sewing and sewing to keep life in her son's body. She was a seamstress who sold sewing to make money. She wanted no more life for herself, teaching him to read, making him those smocks. Knowing she had changed so much in such few years, she dared, as Mrs. Tremaine, return to Boston, so her boy could grow up there, learn a decent trade. He thought of her agreeing with Mr. Lapham for his indenture, smiling as she told him that when she died, he was to go there. When I first saw you, Miss Lavinia went on, I noticed one thing, but it set me thinking. I did nothing for a while, but this spring I asked one of my father's captains, bound for Marseille, to feel about and find out the truth. I did so behind Papa's back. Papa was already too ill to be bothered, but I knew he would want to do right. Like swearing in court, there were never but 4 light cups. She colored angrily. Please let me do the telling. Don't you dare criticize the best man ever lived. Johnny had his own opinion on that. What was the one thing? He asked. The way your hair turns down upon your forehead, that little peak. Remember, we had talked about Johnny's widow's peak, how his hair comes into a little point on his forehead. She was a dark girl. That widow's peak on her was very striking. And then that day in Mr. Dana's court, I did notice you walked like her, light and wild, like a panther, or, she shrugged, maybe only like a tomcat. I admired my cousin so. I may tend to exaggerate her qualities. And what did your captain find out? What I've just told you, and one thing more. Your father, the naval surgeon, was ashamed to be a prisoner of war. He told folks here his name was Latour. That's why your name Tremaine meant nothing to us. That is my true name? Yes, but I haven't much time to talk. Only yesterday I told Papa. He's too ill to speak to you himself. He does want you to know that he did not deliberately cheat you, steal your cup. Mother did take it with her? Yes, it belonged to her. And her maid, Mrs. Denny, went with her. It was Margaret Denny who got her and you out of the convent and onto a ship her brother commanded, and so to Townsend, Maine. That's where I grew up. I remember Aunt Margaret. She died just before Mother took me to Boston. Yes, and Papa says I am to promise you that he will write the whole thing out in black and white. When the war's over, she shrugged, you can put in quite a claim to property, if there's any property left, which I doubt. Anything more you wish to ask me? Yes. What relationship are you to me? What ought I call you? She laughed out loud. Mercy, I don't know. What am I? Why, I suppose I'm a sort of a cousin. But you'd better call me Aunt. Aunt Lavinia. He said it tentatively, kind of with hesitation. Aunt Lavinia? You couldn't even secretly have a romantic passion for an aunt. The strange hold she had had on him for a year snapped. She went to Johnny, stretched out a hand, and touched the widow's peak. All that he had ever got from the beautiful Vinnie Light. Then she was gone.